Normally on Sundays, I like to try to be quick and to the point and make like one point so that one, I can stay focused, and two, hopefully you guys can take that thing and apply it to your daily lives. This Sunday, I'm going to get to that one point, but there's going to be some stops along the way, and I need to move kind of quickly, so try to stay with me here. We're going to jump right in. John chapter 12. This is the final week of Jesus' life. This is the week where he comes to Jerusalem as the king, riding in on the donkey, and they're waving the palm branches and yelling Hosanna and all that. So John 12, verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. 6 days before, they're in Bethany. So Passover is 6 days away. John 12:12. The next day, the great crowd that had come for the festival heard that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. They took palm branches and went out to meet him, shouting, Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the King of Israel. So Passover is now 5 days away, because he said the next day. In case you forgot or need remembering, Passover was one of the biggest, and still is one of the biggest Jewish holidays of the year. They celebrate the time when they escaped from Egypt. The final plague was the plague of the firstborn sons, and the angel of death came through Egypt and killed all the firstborn sons of the Egyptians. But the firstborn sons of the Israelites were spared because they smeared the blood of a lamb above their doors, and thus the angel of death passed over their houses. That's what they're getting ready to celebrate here. Part of the Passover festival celebration is the sacrifice of a lamb without spot or blemish. So the Jews back then, and still some today, will find a perfect lamb without spot or blemish, and they will isolate it for 5 days and inspect it. Keep an eye on it. Make sure it doesn't have the sniffles. Make sure there wasn't a spot or a blemish or some kind of sickness that they didn't notice when they selected it. And they keep it sequestered for 5 days, and then they sacrifice it, if it indeed was perfect. Keep that custom in mind as we look at Jesus' last week on earth. We're going to move over to Luke now. So Matthew, Luke, and John all have accounts of this week, but they all, because they were different people, focused on different things. So we can pull them all together. From John, we can get the timeline. And now we're going to go to Luke for kind of what he was doing overall. It says in Luke 19, verse 47, every day he was teaching at the temple. But the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the leaders among the people were trying to kill him. Yet they could not find any way to do it because all the people hung on his words. So this is how Jesus spent his days leading up to the Passover. He was teaching in the temple, in the presence of the Pharisees, the people, the other leaders. We'll even see that some of the Herodians, the people that were loyal to Herod, were also there. So while he was teaching, he was telling a lot of different parables. You can find a lot of parables in these chapters. They started also questioning, trying to trap him. The first thing they did, they questioned his authority. They said, who gives you the authority to teach? Then Jesus told the parable of the tenants. Basically, he wouldn't answer that question. He kind of blew him off there. And then he told the parable of the tenants. He told the parable of the two sons, some of these other ones. And when he told the parable of the tenants, the Pharisees knew that one was aimed at them. They read between the lines. You know, sometimes the Israelites didn't understand Jesus' parables, but the Pharisees spotted that one and said, he's talking about us. We got to get rid of this guy. And it really ramped them up. They said, we've got to figure out a way to kill him now. Enough's enough. That one was right across the bow. So then in Matthew 22, we can see their next attempt to trap him. When questioning his authority didn't work, they pulled out a good church versus state type of argument, one of those really tricky ones that'll get you tripped up. Matthew 22, verse 15. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. So now we've got Jews, we've got Pharisees, and we've got the state people, the Herodians. Teacher, they said, we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the imperial tax to Caesar or not? I want to spend a little time on this one this morning because I think this passage is important given our current political climate and all the strife and all the tension we've got. The Pharisees, they laid a pretty good trap here. First, they flattered him and set him up. Now, Jesus, we know that you speak truth and truth alone, so whatever you say is going to be it. They set him up that way. So which way is it? Should we pay tax to Caesar or not? It was a good trap because there was no right answer. If he said, don't pay the tax, the Herodians were there. They'd arrest Jesus for sedition. He was going against the empire. We're going to have that. If he said you should pay the tax, the Jews were there. And how are we supposed to pay tax to a Caesar who is setting himself up as a god to be worshiped? How are we supposed to fund an administration that's not anything like what God would want for us? The same arguments are made today. We'll be given two choices. Is it this or is it that? And it'll be presented like those are the only two things, and it's either this understanding or that understanding. And there's no right answer. You're going to upset somebody, you're going to alienate somebody. Your own words will convict you one way or the other. But as we'll see, this either or choice wasn't one that God had presented. It wasn't an either or choice that was something that God said, this is how it goes. Either this or that. But Jesus, verse 18, but Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, you hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax. They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, whose image is this, and whose inscription? Caesar's, they replied. Then he said to them, so give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. I could easily spend the whole morning on this interaction alone. But I want to show how this and all those other things, questioning his authority, the tenants, their frustration, I want to show how it all fits together. So we're going to move kind of quick. But this one's tough. The idea that we should submit to our earthly rulers and pay the tax when they're who they are sometimes, it's really tough. I won't get into politics, but I can be reasonably certain that everyone here either doesn't like the president we have now, didn't like the one we had before, or didn't like either of them. What I'm saying is that anyone who has even a passing understanding of our politics or any interest in it at all has had to have been frustrated over the past couple years. Impossible for you not to be. Guess who else felt like that? The people Jesus was talking to. They weren't happy about the tax. They weren't happy that the Caesars were... They came up with the thing called the imperial cult, where each of the Caesars would be worshipped. In fact, the one that we had right now, he would go around cutting the heads off the statues of the gods that they had and putting his own head on. Like, we think our politicians are bad. These guys are over the top. So how could Jesus be for paying that tax? It's tough to understand, but you heard what Jesus said. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's. Let's think about that statement, though. He held up a denarius. Some of you know Bear's been collecting coins because his parents are mean and won't let him collect Pokemon cards like all his buddies. So when he got into it, I wanted to see, can you get the old coins from the Bible? And I have here a denarius. They think this is probably not the denarius, but one like the denarius that Jesus would have been handed. You can look at it after on the front, there's Caesar Augustus' head. Tiberius was the Caesar at the time. Augustus was his dad. It says Caesar Augustus on it. And on the back, Tiberius' two sons are there. So he says, give to Tiberius what is Tiberius. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. That coin says Caesar. Give to him what is his. And to God what is God's. So what was that? What was that move? Was that a clever sidestep so that he didn't have to answer? I mean, you could say that at first glance, it looked like he just juked his way out of answering that. Because he didn't go into a lot of detail. He didn't draw real clear lines for us and say, this is how you deal with your Caesars up to this point, and then anything beyond that. He didn't do that. He said, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and God what is God's. I think Jesus gave us all we need to know though, if we ask ourselves, what is God's? I think everything is God's. Everything is God's. All authority on heaven and earth. If you remember when Pilate was questioning Jesus, Pilate said, "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above." In other words, if God decided Pilate was out, Pilate was out. If God decided Caesar was out, Caesar was out. Trump, Biden, take your pick. In Romans, it says there is no authority except that which God has established. This is hard for me because I don't understand why God allows some folks to remain in power. If we take Romans at its word, I don't understand why God puts certain people in power. But I do believe that he has the power to take them out. Amen. Out of power, out of the world, if he wants to. Right. So in answering this way, I don't think that Jesus set up some kind of separate but equal, like this is the churches and this is the states. I think the way that Jesus answered put Tiberius where he belongs, under God. I think in answering this way, he says Tiberius, Augustus, Joe Biden, Trump, Putin, any other leader, whoever it might be, belongs under God's authority. Our rulers have a lane that they're responsible for. They have things that they owe us because we pay taxes. Maintaining law and order, infrastructure, foreign policy, stuff like that. We might not like how they do it, but that's the lane that they're in. That's what their job is. But who do we have to teach us about God and what he wants? Clearly, it's not the government's job to do that. And I'm glad it's not. Because, we've had the Church of England and other places where it was a theocracy and it was all mixed together. You look at what the Catholics deal with popes sometimes. When it all gets mixed up like that, it's no good. So what are we to do? I think we're supposed to get along and pay taxes to the IRS. I think we're supposed to pay our speeding ticket fines, pay respect to the judge. But to God, there is so much more due. It's not just about money. Of course, we're supposed to support the church. Of course, we're supposed to meet needs as outlined in scriptures with our money. But to God, we give our hearts and our souls. To God, our conscience is responsible. That tells us where the line is. The coin I've got in my pocket is stamped with the head of the ruler. The coins you've got in your purses say United States on them. Whoever minted that, they put their stamp on it. But we're stamped with the blood of Christ. We, our lives, our souls, our minds, our hearts, are God's. So give to God what is God's. Your heart, your mind, your conscience. Then that sets the line up for us. We are his. So any law that interferes with our heart's relationship with God, any law that interferes with our conscience to God and the things of God, is void because it's not their lane. That tells us where the line is. Their lane is their stuff. Their lane does not involve our relationship to Christ. And so if they say, you've got to do something that gets between me and God, at that point, that law is null and void for me. Matters of conscience and of our relationship to God are his and his alone. After this exchange, the Sadducees got into it with Jesus about what happens after we die. They didn't believe in the resurrection, so they set a good trap. They said, now suppose this woman has a husband and he dies, and then his brother marries her, and then he dies, and there's 7 brothers, and they all die, and all the brothers keep marrying her, and then they all die, including the woman. If there's a resurrection, whose wife is she in the afterlife? Another really good trap. And of course, Jesus answered them in a way that amazed them and shut them up. Then they asked him which commandment was the greatest. Again, they were trying to get him to align with a certain side. There were people who thought that this or that was more important. Does that sound familiar? Are there churches that think that this or that is more important? Are there Christians that think that this or that is more important? Do we pull things together that maybe aren't the things of God, but it's good, it's right, but we make it all about those things? That's what they were trying to do. And again, Jesus answered perfectly. Just like the Passover lamb, Jesus was put under the microscope for 5 days. Is he perfect? They gave him choices in which they thought he has to answer wrong. He has to be wrong on this side or he has to be wrong on that side. And he wasn't. Just like when the Jews inspected their lambs for 5 days before Passover. They inspected our lamb for 5 days before his sacrifice. He passed the test. They questioned his authority. They questioned the church's relationship to the state. They questioned life after death. They questioned the law, all of it. And Jesus was perfect. About all of this, particularly the question about how the church and state gets along or how Christians and the state gets along, Charles Spurgeon had an interesting take. He's always been one of my favorite preachers. And so as I was into this and kind of spinning my wheels a little bit and getting stuck, I wanted to see what he had to say. I'm going to read it. His language is a little different. He lived in the 1800s in England. But he says, the insult to our consciences, which is embodied in the present church and state, is a daily provocation to us as men and Christians. Of the present unrighteous domination, I would say, down with it. As for us, we will never rest till we are free from this excuseless injustice, and free we will be, as sure as God, the God of righteousness, yet lives. That sounds like Pentecostal stuff, bringing the fire. And so I was a little surprised. Like, Spurgeon usually doesn't get on to politics like that. But I get it. I get where he's coming from. That feeling of we can't stand by and watch these idiots destroy our country and our way of life. It's natural, right? He says the stuff they do on a daily basis is an insult. It provokes us. It just pokes the Christian and says, you're wrong, you're wrong. I want you to do the wrong thing. And so he's fired up about it. But then he continued. Now we cannot think about all this and be earnest about it without very much of our strength running in that direction. And that is strength which we would rather spend upon pure spiritual religion. We desire to be always and alone preaching Christ. We desire to be building up his church and living at peace with all our brethren. We need in all things to be giving unto God all our heart and soul and strength. But this altercation concerning God and Caesar will come in. It imperatively demands our attention, and so it distracts us in a measure from our higher work. And therefore, the sooner it is done with, the better. We cannot be always taken up with this matter. We count the gospel to be worth 10,000 times as much. Did you guys catch what he said? He said, if you ask me what I think it's a disaster. Down with them all. Enough's enough. But then he follows it with, but if that's what we're going to focus on, it's going to take a lot of our energy. It's going to take a lot of our time. We're going to be working really hard to change things that are just going to change again and not last. It's going to take time that we could spend on eternal things to work on temporal things. He argues that if you look at the attacks and questions that Jesus faced, you can see that Jesus answered them. He knew they were important, but then he moved on to the question that mattered. Matthew 22:41. While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, what do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he? The son of David, they replied. He said to them, how is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord? For he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. If then David calls him Lord, how can he be his son? No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. There's a lot to be learned from this interaction, from this testing, from this inspection of Jesus over these 5 days. These important people have asked Jesus all the important questions, all the same important questions that we still have. It's the stuff that splits churches and families and causes holy wars. Same stuff existed back then. They could tell that Jesus was wise. I think half of them were threatened, and so they wanted to trap him. And I think the other half wanted Jesus to answer in their favor. They thought they could set the question up so that they would be the right ones when it ended. They had the same debates and the same hang-ups that we do now. They wanted to know with finality who was right. Jesus answered all their questions. They'd give him an A or B option, and he would explain to them, actually, there's a C, and that's the right one. Over and over and over. Blew their minds to the point that nobody would even ask him another question. They were like, we can't handle any more of this truth. After all those questions, he followed it up and he asked them a question, the question that silenced them. What do you think about the Messiah? I believe that all of these things, the imperial tax, the afterlife, all the different things that Jesus went through here, if you put it all together, I think it speaks more than any of them individually. Though there's something to learn individually, I think it says more if you put it together. I spent time on the church and state thing, but it's relevant because I think it's relevant, but I think you could have put any of our debates in there. Any of the things that split churches up and make us argue. Jesus didn't say they weren't important or that they didn't matter. I think his answer showed that they are important and they do matter. And I agree with Spurgeon that when we think about these things, we can't help but be bothered, at the least. More likely, we're infuriated. We're incensed. We're mad. But I think Spurgeon was onto something when he pointed out what Jesus asked after all those questions were heard, all those other answers were heard. Jesus says, "What do you think of the Messiah?" I believe Satan would rather we debate the finer points. Are we good? Yeah. I can't see my notes anymore. There we are. I believe that Satan would rather we debate the finer points like academics at arm's length than he would for us to consider our own relationship to Christ. I think he'd rather us judge our neighbors against our own criteria or the details that our brand of Christianity says are important, rather than considering their relationship with Christ. I think he'd rather our thoughts be consumed with current events so that we are only angry or afraid. I think he'd rather our hope, joy, love, and faith be displaced by division, anger, fear, and a misplaced sense of urgency. I believe Satan would love for us, as the church, to get so involved with denominational differences, politics, and doctrine that it consumes our efforts and turns us into shills for an idea rather than servants of the Lord. There are so many questions that we could ask and debate for years, but I think only one ultimately matters. To me, to you, and most urgently to the one that doesn't know Christ. That question is, what do you think of the Messiah? Let's pray.